All right, guys, Nuance Bro checking in, and today I want to talk about the Kate Steinle case. Now, I've heard a lot of people talk about this case. It's been in the news a lot lately, but I just haven't seen the kind of sort of in-depth analysis about certain parts of the case that I feel a lot of people have missed, and the information just isn't out there right now. Now, if you're not familiar with the Kate Steinle case, I'll refresh your memory right now. So back in 2015, when Trump announced his candidacy in June 16th, 2015, he had that famous moment where he came down the escalators and he made his first speech. And in his first speech, he talked about immigration, and he said it like this.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Now, Trump got a lot of criticism for those comments, and people said, no, illegal immigrants don't commit crime, all of this stuff. They started making arguments about the rates being lower, etc. But then all this kind of came to a halt when Kate Steinle was murdered by an illegal immigrant in San Francisco. Now, keep in mind, this was just 2 weeks after Trump announced his candidacy and made that speech. So this was fresh in the minds of everyone who was criticizing him. And he brought it up numerous times, and it made the rounds in the media, and it became the case for why we should have a wall, and people were using that as justification for the wall, etc. Now, the reason we're talking about this case today is because the jury in San Francisco finally came out with a verdict and claimed that the perpetrator was not guilty of murder. Now, this was on all counts of murder, including second degree and involuntary manslaughter. They gave him some sort of low gun possession charge that they convicted him for, but the serious charges of murder, involuntary manslaughter, they said not guilty. Now, according to the reports, the police interrogated him, and he basically changed his stories multiple times. At first, he was telling them he was born in the 1800s, and that would make him something like 150 something years old. So he was clearly lying. He was claiming he was at different locations than where he actually was. And some people brought up the fact that police lied to the suspect. That's totally fine. Police are allowed to lie to suspects in order to gain information, make them think that they actually have more evidence than they actually do. It's a common tactic, totally legal, totally okay in the law. But they use this tactic, and then the suspect started divulging more information, but he kept changing his story. At first, he was saying, "Oh, well, I didn't do it," blah blah blah, and then he started saying, "Okay, well, I was aiming the gun at the seals, trying to because we have sea lions or seals in the San Francisco Bay," and he claimed he was aiming the gun at them, but then he claimed he wasn't aiming the gun, that he accidentally stepped on the gun, and then, as far as how he found the gun in the first place or came into possession of it, he claimed that he found it under his seat, wrapped up in a t-shirt, and then he just picked it up and he was just wondering what it was, and then all of a sudden he picked it up. And then that, the story converges from there, whether he was aiming it at the seals and then accidentally fired it at Kate Steinle, or if he stepped on it, which I believe is the story they changed it to later, that he stepped on it and then it somehow went off and then shot her. So clearly the suspect is not a trustworthy person. This is a suspect who's been deported, I believe, 5 times, and then came back, was arrested on a marijuana possession charge, and then was released by the San Francisco sheriff at the time. And even though the federal authorities said to the San Francisco sheriff to hold him so that they could probably deal with the situation of him being released, but instead, because San Francisco is a sanctuary city and they have sanctuary city policies, they released him out into the streets, and then he committed this horrific act. Now, the case that I see being made by some media outlets out there is that this is a SIG P239, and that it has an abnormally low trigger weight, and that this could set off the gun just by stepping on it, so it makes the defense's case plausible. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you how that's extremely unlikely and probably most likely false and just total hogwash. So first, I want to show you guys an illustration of the SIG P239. As you can see, it has a hammer, an exposed hammer. And this gun specifically functions in a double action to single action mode. So what that means is when the hammer is down, like it is currently in this picture, the trigger, you can see it's pointed way out, and then you can pull it and it'll actually cock the hammer and then it'll fire from there. So what that means, that's the double action mode. Now the single action mode means the hammer's already cocked back, which usually happens after you fire the first round or if you cock it back manually. And then from there, that's single action mode. Now the trigger weight differences between double action and single action are pretty significant. So this is pretty important, whether the gun was in double action or single action. Now, in double action, the trigger weight is probably closer to about, I'd say 10 pounds or so. I'm not sure on the exact number on that, but I know for the single action on the SIG P239, it's at about 4.4 pounds. Now, for a single action gun, I will say that's still in the normal range, but it is probably in the low normal range. For example, a Glock like this, it has a standard 5.5 pound trigger pull. So I want to show you guys the differences between the triggers between double action and single action. You saw in the first picture, the trigger was kind of way out. And then now in single action, here's a picture. You can see the trigger is pulled back significantly more and it's way more towards the rear. And you can see the hammer is all the way down. So that would be single action mode. So from there, it takes just a little bit more pressure to set the gun off. So instead of the 10 pounds, it's 4.4 pounds. Still a significant amount. You still have to pull that trigger to make it go off. Otherwise, it's not going to go off. But let's talk about why this is important. The jury in this case, according to reports, wanted to see the gun and asked the judge if they could see the gun and basically kind of test it themselves to see if the gun would possibly go off, if they could maybe sort of recreate the circumstances and step on it or everything like that to see if it would go off. And what did the judge do? The judge said no. We don't know exactly why. Maybe the defense objected and said, no, they can't do that for whatever reason. But the judge said no, and the jury wasn't able to verify whether this was even possible in the first place. So a jury that probably wasn't really well educated on gunsmithing or how guns work necessarily, they might be persuaded to think there's a reasonable doubt that this could have possibly happened. And that just that little bit of reasonable doubt was enough to get this guy off on these charges. Now, as far as I remember, this gun belonged to a federal agent and it disappeared from his car. It was reported stolen, I think, 4 days before this murder happened. 4 days. So the chances of this guy just finding a gun wrapped in a t-shirt under his seat, okay, which is already super improbable in the city of San Francisco. I've lived there practically my whole life, and I've never even seen a gun in San Francisco, okay? Let alone one just sitting on the street or some just randomly wrapped in a t-shirt. That just doesn't happen. So the chances of that happening, and then on top of that, him sort of getting into contact with it and then stepping on it and then having it accidentally go off. And then on top of that, they claim that the bullet ricocheted off of the concrete and then hit Kate Steinle in the back. So the chances that a gun laying flat on the ground, shooting flat with the concrete surface, and then all of a sudden hitting it and then bouncing up and hitting Kate Steinle in the back. I mean, all of these scenarios together just sound so unlikely and just so ridiculous that I don't see how you could just see that this guy is just a total liar. Now, one case I'm sure the defense made was probably about the trigger weight being sort of on the low side. And they probably talked about the fact that the SIG P239 doesn't have a safety. Now, it's true, the SIG does not have an external safety on it. But I'm going to show you how, even without a safety, this gun is not going to go off unless you pull that trigger. So this is a YouTube video by Douglas81, and this was uploaded in 2013. So this is way before the Kate Steinle case even happened. So this was just a guy reviewing the gun, basically explaining certain features about it. And he talks about 4 internal safety features or 4 passive safety features on the SIG that will make it impossible for this gun to shoot without the trigger being pulled. So you see them listed here. And if you want, I'm going to leave a link to the video if you want to watch it more in depth and really learn in detail how all these things happen. But he talks about the 4 passive safety features, or the 4 internal / passive safety features. And it consists of the automatic firing pin block, safety intercept notch, hammer bar disconnector, and a decocking lever. So there's a lot of features here, but if you drop the gun, if you scrape it, if somehow the hammer spring that holds the hammer back breaks and it just comes flying at the firing pin, it's not gonna fire because of the blocks and the notches and all these things. So that trigger had to be pulled. Now, this is a Glock 19. This is not a SIG P239, but you know, I got to deal with what I got over here. But pretty much the designs are fairly similar as far as you know, the side profile of the gun and the trigger guard and things like that. If you have a foot going on top of this, it's not going to hit the trigger and pull it. That just won't happen. This area called the trigger guard is designed to protect against that. Now, on top of that, here's a really interesting point. California has something called the California Safe Handgun Roster. Now, this is a safety roster, for better, for worse, whatever you think. It's a roster that only allows the guns on that roster to be sold in the state of California. There's something like 785 models that are currently allowed, that have been approved and are in the roster. Now, what happens with this roster is that gun manufacturers have to send their models that they want approved by the California state government. They have to send them their guns, and they have to submit fees, and then the state of California tests the guns. They do drop testing and firing safety testing, and they basically test it to make sure it's a gun that's safe and can be sold to the public. So they take guns and they do drop tests. They want to make sure that the gun won't fire unless the trigger is pulled. And guess which gun has its models that are approved and are on the California Safe Handgun roster? That's right. You can see it's the P239, the same gun that was used to kill Kate Steinle. Now, I haven't seen these facts mentioned in the media. I haven't seen it even covered by other channels or anything on YouTube. So I decided to bring this up to your guys' attention. I thought it was interesting. And I think that's one of the critical facts that was avoided here is the jury wasn't allowed to see the gun and test it for themselves, and the judge denied that. I don't know what this prosecution team was doing. I don't know what this judge was thinking by not even allowing the jury themselves to determine if something's even possible. It's a critical point that they have to, it's a critical part of this entire process. They have to see if what the claim being made is even possible. So it's just really unfortunate. It's horrible for the family that they're not going to be able to receive justice, at least on the state side. Maybe some federal charges will come on this. And I want to know what you guys think. What do you guys think about this case? How do you think the prosecutors handled it? What do you think is going to happen? But for now, I'm just going to sign out. Thanks for sticking around, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support me on Patreon. Social media links are in the description box below. And I'll see you later.